was coined decades ago by pro-prostitution forces, the buyers and sellers of sex acts, attempting to make prostitution more acceptable by society at large. Even so, it's not accurate. It is meant to lend a you know what? I made this so big that I can't read. I don't need my glasses. Attempting to make prostitution more acceptable by society at large. It is meant to lend a degree of acceptance to what is a brutal, dangerous, and dehumanizing activity that primarily injures women, and to privilege those who participate in these activities. It is a tool of propaganda. Women, youth, LGBTQIA+ persons are trafficked, trapped, and enticed into the sex trade due to poverty, sexual abuse, domestic violence, rejection by family, homelessness, difficulty in finding work, lack of education, and the need for acceptance, financial help, and shelter. You know, basically the same things as what she was talking about. You know, it's just been around forever. This is how women are forced to take care of themselves. Consent, or between consenting adults as terms, as the prostitution forces would have us believe, almost never is the route by which people are entered into sex trade. In the 1990 movie Pretty Woman, the central character played by Julia Roberts lives as an independent life, free to choose whom she will date and have sexual relations with, but is currently down on her luck alone. Her sex buyer is a handsome and wealthy playboy, portrayed by Richard Gere, on a business trip to L.A., who dresses her up as his beautiful escort for a week and ends up caring about her very much like the prior story that we just heard happened to some of these women if they were nice looking. Clearly a Hollywood fantasy, or as now being more widely understood, a part of the public's grooming process to accept this. Just as the things that you heard from the prior speaker, that the public is groomed to accept this treatment of women. 42 million Americans saw that movie. It has influenced a generation of impressionable young women and men who have come to believe that choosing sex work equates with women's freedom and autonomy. A very small portion of women work as escorts or call girls and may have a somewhat safer experience, but they are not representative of the prostituted population in general. In segments of Desperate Housewives, the TV series, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, we have seen throughout that programming the same sort of grooming of the masses again. There was a series that went on of where the husband was out of work. The guy's name was Mike. And so she was the housewife was solicited to be a housewife on the internet and make money by videoing herself naked or half naked or sexually dressed and in sexual poses, quote unquote, cleaning her house. Again, a grooming of the masses to accept this as this is a good way to make easy, fast money that we all need. Contrary to the pervasive narrative about prostitution as a form of sexual liberation and economic freedom, an alternative and correct narrative exposes prostitution as a form of structural oppression in which race, gender, and class intersect. The commercial sexual exploitation of women is a form of gender-based violence. It is the most extreme version of violent types of oppression of women, which include widespread sexual harassment and high rates of domestic violence, sexual assault, and rape. These systematic patterns of abuse of women and girls are connected. They serve to reinforce and perpetuate women's inequality. The National Organization for Women and our allies are committed to ending men's demand for the sexual use and abuse of women's bodies and the general public's acceptance. We are committed to the work of removing criminal penalties imposed on prostituted persons. We advocate for continuation of criminal prohibitions against the buyers, the johns, the pimps, the recruiters, the traffickers, the owners, operators of brothels, or other businesses where prostitution is facilitated. The commercial sex industry includes street prostitution, massage parlors, brothels, escort services, out-call services, strip clubs, lap dancing, phone sex, adult and child pornography, video and internet pornography, and prostitution tourism or sex tourism. The name used in the grooming campaign is sex tourism. The name where even more men make money off the backs of women, girls, and boys. It becomes more acceptable. It's now a part. The government becomes involved because of the tourism boards. It's sold to travel agents as something that's acceptable to sell to men who want to go overseas and rape and sexually abuse, actually, their children.
Yep.
So, you know, my point to you all is grooming, the grooming of the public to accept this, to quiet people down, to say that this is a better thing to happen for the society, because it could be worse if we didn't allow this because of men. With the assistance of and the demand and empower prostituted women and people, our National Committee now advocates for expunging the criminal records of persons who have been prostituted and for the provision of social services such as housing, counseling, medical care, detoxification, training, and employment assistance. This approach is known as the Swedish model or the Nordic model. The value of commercial sex exploitation was estimated by the International Labor Organization at $99 billion in a 2017 report. Sexual exploitation produces 66% of the proceeds of global trafficking. So this is a big business. You know, the rest is like in labor force, you know, domestic labor and farm working and those kinds of things. A recent film on prostitution and trafficking in Southern California, Shattered Dreams, noted that those activities just in the San Diego area amounted to $800 million annually. Trafficking and prostitution overlap and are frequently tied in with the illicit drug market and organized crime. The industry promotes full decriminalization and legalization around the world, including in the U.S., and is behind efforts in New York, New Hampshire, California, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C. And what this is decriminalizing the buyers of sex. That is their main goal, is once again grooming the public to find this acceptable. These forces fund small grassroots organizations, back political candidates, hire professional lobbyists to promote full decriminalization, write legislation, develop talking points, and fund friendly journalists. And there are many friendly journalists. Billionaire George Soros, who contributes to many progressive organizations, uses his millions to finance full decriminalization and legalization efforts in many countries. His funding likely helped to push the full decriminalization effort in the District of Columbus, which we just went through, and reportedly his money is fueling efforts to stop implementation of the Nordic equality model in the Republic of Ireland. Now helped to stop the D.C. Council full decriminalization bill, which was an important victory. It's important because we are one of the few major organizations willing to speak out and to speak truth to power. So many other organizations depend on government funding or funding from major organizations that even though they should be speaking out, they're afraid of being defunded. So they are effectively neutered. Again, this is a part of the grooming, because you will hear, well, there are many in the domestic violence movement that will not speak out against this, or they haven't said anything, or they don't have a position. We've even been told that the UN women, we haven't been told, this is a fact, the UN women actually supported full decriminalization until they were called out on it, and then they moved to a neutral position, and then finally they are now considering speaking out against it. And what is it about? Funding. They were funded to do these things, just like prostituted people are. So in New Hampshire, Governor Chris Sununu has vowed to veto any decriminalization bill. In Rhode Island, it's doubtful that the legislation will allow a return of legal prostitution after having suffered through 29 years of legal indoor prostitution where massage parlors and organized crime flourish. So to be clear, the decriminalization bill passed in Rhode Island and was in effect for 29 years, unknown to me until I started doing this this work, and I imagine to most people. So it was pushed there, and Rhode Island became known as the sex tourism capital of New England during this time. And the bill got kind of balled up, and the legislation got balled up, and so finally what happened, it went to court, and then a judge decided that it could be legal if it was indoors. It was this people on the street where it was illegal. So as long as it was indoors, off the street, much like the paper that she's just told us the facts, you know, it's history doesn't change, it just pops out in a different place. And we heard this when we were doing this testimony at the Washington, D.C. We have these neighborhoods, these people that come forward that say, oh, I'm against this, I'm opposed to it. I was speaking on the panel with this one man who was from his neighborhood, who was speaking out against it, and we were having a private little chat, and because I wondered about what he was doing there and why he was opposed to full decriminalization. Well, it turns out he was just opposed to streetwalkers on his street. He just wanted them to go indoors. He really didn't care if it was indoors. So that's what that story is. So eventually, Rhode Island was just so overwhelmed, and Providence was so overwhelmed with the trafficking of children and women into Rhode Island and into Providence, because what happens is when it's legalized, when it's decriminalized, it increases the demand. It's the grooming of the public. Oh, it's off the street, you've cleaned it up, it's over here, now it's okay. But then what happens is, yeah, it's okay for the buyers to be sexually abusing and molesting human beings. Why is that acceptable in our society? So eventually, the bill was overturned, and they're back. I'm not saying that they're in a good situation here, but it was completely overturned. But it took 30 years for that to happen. California has passed a bill that would make it difficult to prosecute any buyers of sex. The one thing I want to tell you, though, and it's when it's fully decriminalized, is that means that child pornography, people who have been sex trafficked, that when the police find out about it and they have found like children and they are going in to rescue them, they're in brothels, they can't do that because it's been completely decriminalized. And so you hear this argument about this happening between consenting adults or a further grooming of the public. And that's why we should decriminalize all of this, you know, because this is happening. But there's no consideration then for unintended consequences that the people that are not consenting, and who is it really that makes that fine line, they can't do anything about it because it's been decriminalized. So they can't go in, they can't rescue the children, they know they're in there, they know what's going on with them, and the women, you know, the adult people. It's again, they say that this is not going to happen, but in fact it does happen. So the New York legislature, facing a decriminalization bill, will consider the equality model to remove criminal prohibitions from prostituted persons and establish programs to help persons leave the sex trade. This legislation is modeled on the French Nordic or equality model, which has strong exit support programs. Harm to women and others engaged in selling sex acts suffer tremendously. In a sample of 100 prostituted women working in D.C., 42% met the criteria for post-traumatic post-traumatic stress disorder. 61% reported being physically assaulted. 80% reported being threatened with a weapon. 44% had been raped in prostitution, and 60% of those rapes were committed by sex buyers because that's what they wanted. They wanted to rape. And it was okay. Survivors report being raped, sometimes repeatedly, by their pimps. Other stories of prostituted persons in various communities record even higher rates of physical assault, rape, and being threatened with a weapon. The risk that prostituted women face with being murdered is significant. The murder of women in Rhode Island went up significantly when it was decriminalized. In the U.S., we have seen many sickening examples of scores of prostituted women murdered by serial killers. Trans women involved in prostitution are at an even higher risk of violence as well. Survivors report that their pimps threaten, beat, and even rape them in order to keep them under control. We know from their stories that many women caught in prostitution are forced into addiction, being shot up while unconscious to keep them under control so that they need drugs. Then they must pay to feed their addiction. It's insidious. Pimps keep all the money from the sex acts. These facts are ones that keep women and girls trapped in prostitution. Most women have entered prostitution as teenagers. They may have been runaways, perhaps abused at home, experiencing serious poverty, and offered money and support by someone that they initially trusted, someone who became their boyfriend, who said that they loved them, who gave them a place to stay, bought them clothes, and made them feel wanted. Then they are forced to prostitute themselves to produce an income for their pimps. Pimps aim to keep a number of prostituted persons under control, demanding that they produce as much as $100,000 each year by meeting high quotas for the pimp, not for the women. It's such a difficult and dehumanizing experience that prostituted persons find it very difficult to figure out how to safely exit the trade. They make repeated attempts to leave only to fall back. Exit programs that understand the reality of their lives and offer services necessary to overcome the trauma and rebuild their lives are essential. Racism and structural oppression trap a disproportionate number of women and girls of color in prostitution in the U.S. and elsewhere. We know from the D.C. Hearings that we attended that there were a high rate of high school and middle school girls being approached here in D.C. in wards 1, 7, and 8. Wards 1, 7, and 8 to entice, coerce, and even abduct them, children, into prostitution. And many of them are reported as gone missing or as runaways, when in fact they have been stolen. This pattern is repeated in many cities around the country. Young women are particularly in demand as buyers believe that the risk of contracting HIV is less. The Nordic model now believes that the best solution to this systematic violence and oppression is an end to the demand by sex buyers. The solution is definitely not full decriminalization or legislation. Those approaches have been used over and over again and have been shown in other countries to increase prostitution and trafficking along with crime. The best solution is to remove criminal prohibitions and penalties on prostituted persons, including prostituted trans people, and expunge police records. Most importantly, those who wish to escape the life of abuse, addiction, and violence of the commercial trade should be provided with health care services, substance abuse, rehabilitation, and employment opportunities. This approach was first developed in Sweden 20 years ago, and it has been successful in motivating people to leave the trade and in reducing the number of buyers. The model solution offers a safer, healthier life and a life worth living to prostituted persons. It's by far the more rational and humane answer to end the systematic abuses of marginalized women, youth, and LGBTQIA plus persons. We know it won't be easy, and we know it will take years to see the Nordic model adopted by states, but now's goal, with the help of our committee, is state by state to pass the Nordic model here in this country and end the grooming of our general public and the acceptance of this violence against women. Thanks.